Just across a narrow valley from Jerusalem's eastern wall stands a rounded ridge covered in ancient tombs, olive trees, and churches. It is not dramatic in appearance, but this hill has witnessed more pivotal moments in three religions than almost any piece of ground on earth. David walked over it weeping. Ezekiel saw a vision on it. Jesus prayed on it the night before his death, and Zechariah wrote a prophecy about it that believers have been reading for 2,500 years. The Mount of Olives rises about 60 meters above the Temple Mount, separated from it by the Kidron Valley, a narrow, rocky ravine that has served as a burial ground for millennia. Its slopes are dotted with the oldest Jewish cemetery in continuous use in the world, where people have been buried for over 3,000 years because of a belief rooted in Zechariah 14:4 that the resurrection will begin there. This is a hell where history has accumulated in layers and where some of the most emotionally charged moments in the entire biblical narrative took place. Let us begin with King David, because the Mount of Olives story starts long before the New Testament. In 2 Samuel 15, David is fleeing Jerusalem during the rebellion of his son Absalom. Verse 30 says he went up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, and his head was covered, and he was walking barefoot. It is one of the most humanly devastating moments in all of Scripture. The greatest king of Israel, barefoot, in tears, climbing a hill while his city falls behind him. The route he took, going east over the Mount of Olives and into the wilderness toward the Jordan, is still the same ridge today. Then there is Ezekiel. In his extraordinary vision recorded in Ezekiel 11:23, the glory of the Lord departs the temple in Jerusalem and rests on the mountain east of the city, the Mount of Olives. For the prophet, this was the most devastating possible image, the divine presence abandoning the city to its coming destruction. The Babylonians came, Jerusalem burned, and the Mount of Olives stood silent on the eastern horizon. The most famous prophetic text connected to this hill is Zechariah 14:4, written after the Babylonian exile. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley. This verse has been interpreted within Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions as pointing toward a future event at this location. Remarkably, geologists have confirmed that the Mount of Olives sits directly on a fault line, the same East African rift system that underlies the Jordan Valley. A seismic event along this fault could, in theory, split the ridge. Scripture and geology sit in unexpected proximity here. Now to the night in Gethsemane. All four Gospels place Jesus in a garden on the Mount of Olives on the night before his crucifixion. Matthew 26:36 names it Gethsemane, from the Aramaic gat shemanim, meaning oil press, consistent with a working olive grove. Jesus prays there while the disciples sleep. Judas arrives with the arresting party. This is where the Passion narrative begins in earnest. The traditional site of Gethsemane is today enclosed within the Church of All Nations, also called the Basilica of the Agony, built in 1924 over earlier Byzantine and Crusader-era churches on the same spot. Just outside this church stand 8 ancient olive trees. In 2012, scientists from the Istituto Agrario di San Michele all'Adige in Italy extracted DNA and core samples from these trees and published their findings. The results showed that the trees share the same genetic lineage, suggesting they all grew from the root system of trees that were cut down, possibly during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when Josephus records that Titus ordered trees cut for siege equipment. The root systems, however, are far older. The researchers estimated the visible trunks grew back from ancient roots dating at least the 10th century AD, but the root base could predate them significantly. These are not the trees of Gethsemane in the 1st century, but they may be growing where those trees stood. Slightly up the slope is the Church of Dominus Flevit, the Lord wept, marking the traditional spot where Jesus looked over Jerusalem and wept over the city, Luke 19:41. During construction in 1953 to 1955, Franciscan archaeologist Bellarmino Bagatti excavated the site and found a 1st century Jewish cemetery with dozens of ossuaries, stone bone boxes bearing names in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. These were not aristocratic family tombs, they were ordinary working people, the social world the Gospels describe. The Kidron Valley below the Mount of Olives contains some of the most impressive visible 1st century monuments in all of Jerusalem. The so-called Tomb of Absalom and the Tomb of Zechariah are not actually connected to those biblical figures, but they were carved from the living rock in the Second Temple period, likely as the tombs of wealthy priestly families. They stand today exactly as they were carved 2,000 years ago, unreconstructed. From David's barefoot grief to Ezekiel's vision of departure, from Gethsemane's olive roots to the ossuaries of ordinary people with New Testament names, the Mount of Olives is a hill soaked in history at every level. It has watched empires rise and fall, and it is still there, patient on the eastern horizon of Jerusalem. Next time, we descend into the most personal miracle in the Gospels and find the village that has kept its name for 2,000 years.